The House of the Rising Sun is a traditional folk song, sometimes called Rising Sun Blues. It tells of a life gone wrong in New Orleans. The most successful commercial version, recorded in 1964 by the English rock group The Animals, was a #1 hit in the United Kingdom, the United States, Sweden, Finland, and Canada. Origin and early versions. Like many classic folk ballads, the authorship of The House of the Rising Sun is uncertain. Musicologists say that it is based on the tradition of broadside ballads such as The Unfortunate Rake of the 18th century, and that English emigrants took the song to America where it was adapted to its later New Orleans setting. There is also a mentioning of a house-like pub called the Rising Sun in the classic Black Beauty tale, which was set in London, England and was published in 1877, which may or may not have influenced the song's title. Alan Price of The Animals has stated that the song was originally a 16th-century English folk song about a Soho brothel. The oldest known existing recording is by Appalachian artists Clarence Tom Ashley and Gwen Foster, who recorded it for Vocalion Records in 1934. Ashley said he had learned it from his grandfather, Enoch Ashley. The song was among those collected by folklorist Alan Lomax, who, along with his father, was a curator of the Archive of American Folk Song for the Library of Congress. On an expedition with his wife to eastern Kentucky, Lomax set up his recording equipment in Middlesboro, Kentucky, in the house of a singer and activist named Tillman Cadle. In 1937 he recorded a performance by Georgia Turner, the 16-year-old daughter of a local miner. He called it the Rising Sun Blues. Lomax later recorded a different version sung by Burt Martin and a third sung by Dor Henson, both Eastern Kentucky singers. In his 1941 songbook Our Singing Country, Lomax credits the lyrics to Turner, with reference to Martin's version. According to his later writing, the melody bears similarities to the traditional English ballad, Matty Groves. Roy Acuff, an early-day friend and apprentice of Ashley, learned it from him and later recorded it as Rising Sun. In 1941, Woody Guthrie recorded a version. A recording made in 1947 by Josh White, who is also credited with having written new words and music that have subsequently been popularized in the versions made by many other later artists, was released by Mercury Records in 1950. Lead Belly recorded two versions of the song in February 1944 and in October 1948, called In New Orleans, and The House of the Rising Sun respectively. The latter was recorded in sessions that later became the album Lead Belly's Last Sessions. In 1957 Glenn Yarbrough recorded the song for Elektra Records. The song is also credited to Ronnie Gilbert on one of the Weavers' albums released in the late 1940s or early 1950s. Pete Seeger released a version on Folkways Records in 1958, which was re-released by Smithsonian Folkways in 2009. Frankie Laine recorded the song then titled New Orleans on his 1959 album Balladeer. Actor and comedian Andy Griffith recorded the song on his 1959 album Andy Griffith Shouts the Blues and Old-Timey Songs. Joan Baez recorded it in 1960 on her debut album. She frequently performed the song in concert throughout her career. In 1960 Miriam Makeba recorded the song on her eponymous RCA album. In late 1961, Bob Dylan recorded the song for his debut album, released in March 1962. That release had no songwriting credit, but the liner notes indicate that Dylan learned this version of the song from Dave Van Ronk. In an interview on the documentary No Direction Home, Van Ronk said that he was intending to record the song, and that Dylan copied his version. He recorded it soon thereafter on Just Dave Van Ronk. I had learned it sometime in the 1950s, from a recording by Hallie Wood, the Texas singer and collector, who had got it from an Alan Lomax field recording by a Kentucky woman named Georgia Turner. I put a different spin on it by altering the chords and using a bass line that descended in half steps, a common enough progression in jazz, but unusual among folk singers. By the early 1960s, the song had become one of my signature pieces, and I could hardly get off the stage without doing it. Nina Simone recorded her first version on Nina at the Village Gate in 1962. Later versions include the 1965 recording in Colombia by Los Speakers in Spanish called La Casa del Sol Nascent, which was also the title of their second album. They earned a silver record. The Chambers Brothers recorded a version on Feelin' the Blues, released on Vault Records. The Animals version, an interview with Eric Burdon revealed that he first heard the song in a club in Newcastle, England, where it was sung by the Northumbrian folk singer Johnny Handel. The Animals were on tour with Chuck Berry and chose it because they wanted something distinctive to sing. This interview refutes assertions that the inspiration for their arrangement came from Bob Dylan. The band enjoyed a huge hit with the song, much to Dylan's chagrin when his version was referred to as a cover. The irony of this was not lost on Dave Van Ronk, who said the whole issue was a tempest in a teapot, and that Dylan stopped playing the song after the Animals hit because fans accused Dylan of plagiarism. Dylan has said he first heard the Animals version on his car radio and jumped out of his car seat, because he liked it so much. Dave Marsh described the Animals' take on the House of the Rising Sun as the first folk rock hit, sounding as if they'd connected the ancient tune to a live wire. Writer Ralph McLean of the BBC agreed that it was arguably the first folk rock tune, calling it a revolutionary single after which the face of modern music was changed forever. Van Ronk claims that this version was based on his arrangement of the song. The Animals version transposes the narrative of the song from the point of view of a woman led into a life of degradation, to that of a man, whose father was now a gambler and drunkard, as opposed to the sweetheart in earlier versions. The Animals had begun featuring their arrangement of House of the Rising Sun during a joint concert tour with Chuck Berry, using it as their closing number to differentiate themselves from acts that always closed with straight rockers. It got a tremendous reaction from the audience, convincing initially reluctant producer Mickey Most that it had hit potential, and between tour stops the group went to a small recording studio on Kingsway in London to capture it. Recorded in just one take on May 18, 1964, it started with a famous electric guitar A minor chord arpeggio by Hilton Valentine. The performance took off with Burdon's lead vocal, which has been variously described as howling, soulful, and as deep and gravelly as the northeast English coal town of Newcastle that spawned him. Finally, Alan Price's pulsating organ part completed the sound. Burdon later said, "We were looking for a song that would grab people's attention." House of the Rising Sun was a transatlantic hit, after having reached the top of the UK pop singles chart in July 1964, it topped the US pop singles chart 2 months later in September, when it became the first British invasion #1 unconnected with the Beatles. It was the group's breakthrough hit in both countries and became their signature song. The song was less successful in Ireland, only peaking at number 10 and dropping off the charts 1 week later. Ireland had the show band scene and did not consider rhythm and blues a very popular type of music. The song was also a hit in a number of other countries. The Animals' rendering of the song is recognised as one of the classics of British pop music. Writer Lester Bangs labelled it a brilliant rearrangement, and a new standard rendition of an old standard composition. It ranked number 122 on Rolling Stone magazine's 500 Greatest Songs of All Time list. It is also one of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame's 500 songs that shaped rock and roll. The RIAA placed it as number 240 on their Songs of the Century list. In 1999 it received a Grammy Hall of Fame award. It has long since become a staple of oldies and classic rock radio formats. A 2005 poll ranked it as Britain's 4th favourite #1 song. As recorded, House of the Rising Sun ran 4.5 minutes, regarded as far too long for a pop single at the time. Producer Most, who otherwise minimised his role on this occasion, everything was in the right place. It only took 15 minutes to make, so I can't take much credit for the production. Nonetheless was now a believer and declared it as a single at its full length, saying, "We're in a microgroove world now, we will release it." In the United States, though, the original single was a 2:58 version. The MGM Golden Circle reissue featured the unedited 4:29 version, although the label shows the edited playing time of 2:58. The edited version was included on the group's 1964 US debut album The Animals, while the full version was later included on their best-selling 1966 U.S. Greatest Hits album The Best of the Animals. However, the very first American release of the full-length version was on a 1965 album of various groups entitled Mickey Most Presents British Go-Go, the cover of which, under the listing of House of the Rising Sun, boasted, "Original Uncut Version." Americans also could hear the complete version in the movie Go-Go Mania in the spring of 1965. House of the Rising Sun was not included on any of the group's British albums. Rather, it was reissued as a single twice in subsequent decades, charting both times, to number 25 in 1972, and to number 11 in 1982. The arranging credit went only to Alan Price. According to Burden, this was simply because there was insufficient room to name all 5 band members on the record label, and Alan Price's first name was first alphabetically. However, this meant that only Price received songwriters' royalties for the hit, a fact that has caused bitterness ever since, especially with Valentine. Sales and certifications, Frigid Pink version. In 1969, Detroit band Frigid Pink recorded a version of House of the Rising Sun that became an international hit in 1970. Sometimes described as psychedelic, their rendition is more in line with the proto-punk sound of fellow Detroit acts MC5 and the Stooges. Their version is in April 4th time, and was driven by Gary Ray Thompson's distorted guitar with fuzz and wah-wah effects, set against the frenetic drumming of Richard Stevers. According to Stevers, the Frigid Pink recording of House of the Rising Sun was done impromptu when there was time left over at a recording session booked for the group at the Tira Sherma Recording Studios. Stevers later played snippets from that session's tracks for Paul Cannon, the music director of Detroit's premier rock radio station WKNR. Stevers knew Cannon as his girlfriend's father. Stevers recalls, "We went through the whole thing and Cannon didn't say much. Then House of the Rising Sun started up and I immediately turned it off because it wasn't anything I really wanted him to hear." However, Cannon was intrigued and had Stevers play the complete track for him, then advising Stevers, "Tell Parrott, Frigid Pink's label to drop God Gave Me You, the group's current single, and go with this one." Frigid Pink's House of the Rising Sun debuted at number 29 on the WKNR hit parade dated January 6, 1970, and broke nationally after some 7 weeks, during which the track was reserviced to Radio 3 to Mies, with a number 73 debut on the Hot 100 in Billboard dated February 27, 1970, with a subsequent 3-week ascent to the top 30 en route to a Hot 100 peak of number 7 on April 4, 1970. The certification of the Frigid Pink single House of the Rising Sun as a gold record for domestic sales of 1 million units was reported in the issue of Billboard dated May 30, 1970. The Frigid Pink single of House of the Rising Sun would afford the song its most widespread international success, with top 10 status reached in Austria, Belgium, Canada, Denmark, Germany, Greece, Ireland, Israel, the Netherlands, Norway, Poland, Sweden, Switzerland and the UK. The single also charted in Australia, France and Italy. Sales and certifications, Jody Miller, Dolly Parton versions. The song has twice been a hit record on Billboard's country chart. In 1973, Jody Miller reached number 29 on the country charts and number 41 on the adult contemporary chart. In September 1981, Dolly Parton released a cover of the song as the third single from her 9 to 5 and Odd Jobs album. Like Miller's earlier country hit, Parton's remake returns the song to its original lyric of being about a fallen woman. The Parton version makes it quite blunt with a few new lyric lines that were written by Parton. Parton's remake reached number 14 on the US country singles chart, and crossed over to the pop charts, where it reached number 77 on the Billboard Hot 100. It also reached number 30 on the USAC charts. Parton has occasionally performed the song live, perhaps most notably, on her 1987-88 television show, in an episode taped live in New Orleans. Five Finger Death Punch version. American heavy metal band Five Finger Death Punch released a cover of House of the Rising Sun on their fifth studio album The Wrong Side of Heaven and the Righteous Side of Hell, Volume 2, which was later released as the album's second single and the band's third single during the Wrong Side era. The references to New Orleans have been changed to Sin City, a reference to the negative impact gambling in Las Vegas can have. The song was a top 10 hit on mainstream rock radio in the United States. The Blaggers version. In 1989, Blaggers ITA released a parody of House of the Rising Sun, called House of the Fascist Scum, on their first album On Your Toys. As the track name suggests, its lyrics differ from the original version and are aimed against neo-fascists. The band had close links with anti-fascist action, donating money to the organization and promoting its ideology. Gregory Isaacs' version. Reggae icon Gregory Isaacs recorded a cover of The House of the Rising Sun for his 1992 album Pardon Me. Possible real locations. Various places in New Orleans, Louisiana have been proposed as the inspiration for the song, with varying plausibility. The phrase House of the Rising Sun is often understood as a euphemism for a brothel, but it is not known whether or not the house described in the lyrics was an actual or fictitious place. One theory speculated the song is about a daughter who killed her father, an alcoholic gambler who had beaten his wife. Therefore, the House of the Rising Sun may be a jailhouse, from which one would be the first person to see the sun rise. Because women often sang the song, another theory is that the House of the Rising Sun was where prostitutes were detained while treated for syphilis. Since cures with mercury were ineffective, going back was very unlikely. Only 3 candidates that use the name Rising Sun have historical evidence. See from old city directories and newspapers. The first was a small short-lived hotel on Conti Street in the French Quarter in the 1820s. It burned down in 1822. An excavation and document search in early 2005 found evidence that supported this claim, including an advertisement with language that may have euphemistically indicated prostitution. Archaeologists found an unusually large number of pots of rouge and cosmetics at the site. The second possibility was a late 19th century Rising Sun Hall listed in late 19th century city directories on what is now Cherokee Street at the riverfront of the uptown Carrollton neighborhood, which seems to have been a building owned and used for meetings of a social aid and pleasure club, commonly rented out for dances and functions. It also is no longer extant. Definite links to gambling or prostitution are undocumented for either of these buildings. A third was the Rising Sun, which advertised in several local newspapers in the 1860s, located on what is now the lakeside of the 100 block of Decatur Street. 1. In various advertisements described as a restaurant, a lager beer salon, and a coffee house. At the time, New Orleans businesses listed as coffee houses often also sold alcoholic beverages. Bizarre New Orleans, a guidebook on New Orleans, asserts that the real house was at 1614 Esplanade Avenue between 1862 and 1874 and was purportedly named for its Madame, Marianne Le Soleil Levant, whose name translates from French as the Rising Sun. Metaphoric locations. It is also possible that the House of the Rising Sun is a metaphor for either the slave pens of the plantation house, or the plantation itself, which were the subjects and themes of many traditional blues songs. Dave Van Ronk claimed in his autobiography that he had seen pictures of the Old Orleans Parish Women's Prison, which had an entrance decorated with a rising sun design. He considered this proof that the House of the Rising Sun had been a nickname for the prison. The role of the singer is variable. Earlier versions of the song are often sung from the woman's perspective, a woman who followed a drunk or a gambler to New Orleans and became a prostitute in the House of the Rising Sun, such as in Joan Baez's version on her self-titled 1960 debut album, or Jody Miller's 1973 single. The Animals version was sung from a perspective of a man, for whom the house has been his ruin. Bob Dylan's 1962 version and Sean Mullins' covered version on his album Ninth Ward Pickin' Parlor is sung from the woman's perspective. Not everyone, however, believes that the house actually existed. Pamela D'Arsney, a research librarian working at the Williams Research Center in New Orleans, is quoted as saying, "I have made a study of the history of prostitution in New Orleans and have often confronted the perennial question, where is the House of the Rising Sun? Without finding a satisfactory answer. Although it is generally assumed that the singer is referring to a brothel, there is actually nothing in the lyrics that indicate that the house is a brothel. Many knowledgeable persons have conjectured that a better case can be made for either a gambling hall or a prison. However, to paraphrase Freud, sometimes lyrics are just lyrics. References, notes. External links, Song Facts House of the Rising Sun entry, The Sheet Music, full lyrics of this song at Metro Lyrics.